everything you do, you don't think, this is amazing, this will change the tide of the history or whatever. You're just there and you do it.
Margaret, thank you so much for coming to the Australian Music Vault.
My pleasure.
I just wanted to start very early in your career. I just wanted to find out when did you first start singing?
Professionally? Or?
No, actually, even before that. When did you start singing? When did you first experience the joy of singing?
In kindergarten. Truly, I remember singing at the Christmas party in kindergarten. And I would have been 4, and I even dragged up my 2-year-old sister to sing with me. I mean, my mother was a lovely singer, much better than me, lovely voice, and we would harmonise over the dishes and just around the house and to the radio and things like that. Other than that, yes, we were in church choir, and I was in the school choir. And again, my sister and I, we won the talent quest at high school, singing a cappella duo. The first paid performance, very easy for me to remember when it was. It was Mother's Day back in 1963. I particularly remember it because my poor benighted mother was in the audience. I only performed 4 songs, I think. And one of them was Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child on Mother's Day with my mother there. Very insensitive I was at 19, but anyway, yes, it was. Didn't even pretend to play the guitar back then. It was just my voice and a double bass player. And we rehearsed 3 songs. I was booked to sing 3 songs. And very fortunate, in spite of apparently my knocking knees out of nervousness, I must have transcended the look with the sound, because I had to do an encore, and Graham McLean, the bass player, and I didn't have an extra one, so that was totally a cappella. And that actually led to my second performance further down the road, because the MC had to sort of stop the audience after even carrying on after the encore and say, no, we'll move on with the program, but Margaret, I'll book Margaret later in the season. So. And this winter Sunday afternoon folk concert season at the Emerald Hill Theatre was sort of progressing through the season, and I realised I hadn't been rebooked. So I confronted Glenn Tomasetti, it was, who gave me my first gig, and said, how about it, Glenn? And I don't know whether she was being cute or not, but whatever. She just said, since you've been on, Margaret, I've had lots of inquiries about people who don't play, but they want to sing here, and I've made it a rule. You have to accompany yourself when you're here. Oh, really? Okay, so I went home, taught myself the guitar in a couple of weeks, and came back and said, okay. I only accompanied myself on 1 song, and the rest were a cappella, but definitely listening to Harry Belafonte. He was known for Mr. Calypso. You know, he introduced so-called calypsos, often just composed songs in the style of to the rest of the world. But by buying his albums, they were also lots of things like lullabies and work songs and the odd chain gang song, the odd blues, whatever it was. It really was folk music in its broadest sense that he was doing. I didn't realise that. I just thought he does calypsos or he does blues. And I remember folk music being that rather fol-de-rol diddle-I-day stuff that we had to sing along with the radio with our little books in school. And I thought, if that's folk music, I don't care for it. But not realising that the other stuff I was interested in, you know, which was Mahalia Jackson singing gospel songs, well, that's folk music. As the calypsos and the lullabies and the work songs and the old English ballads where you didn't understand half the references and double entendres or whatever, but it was all like a big, wide world of mystery out there that I discovered through music. Other people go to university. I just immersed myself in folk music, and through which I was able to get into poetry and politics and parody and, you know, history, geography, epic songs from centuries ago in Europe up to tomorrow's headlines. For me, that's all folk music. So although I don't want to be classified as any sort of singer, if I have to have a label, I'll go with that one. If only the general populace also agreed with me and my definition, that'd be all right. World music wasn't a term back then, but world music is folk music. Not all folk music is world music, but early jazz is folk music. Most blues are folk music, apart from, the old traditional songs in foreign languages and the bush ballads or whatever. And contemporary singer-songwriter stuff does the same sort of role as folk music used to do. Folk music's got a bit of grit in it, So yes, if I have to classify myself, I'm a folk singer, but some people haven't seen me in that context. They go to a jazz festival and I'm there with a jazz band, so they think I'm a jazz and blues singer, and I am. But so I don't like to be put in the box because it discounts all the other things. I've done cabaret and theatre music, and I've been a lecturer on black gospel music. And if I was a songwriter, it'd be terribly easy. People just say, "Oh, singer-songwriter, da da da." Well, you're happy to... I don't write songs. Can you just call me a singer? Oh, no. got to put you in a box. So, okay. And what sort of songs do you sing? I sing interesting songs that you may not know. Folk music was a minority music, but it was a huge minority music. We couldn't really compete with the Beatles, but other than that, it was very popular. It started to be played on the radio, and there were even some television shows that were devoted to folk music back then. And you were quite content to play in places that I wouldn't dream of playing now, like in the corner of a restaurant, because it would be that when you started, people would stop their eating or stop their chatting and pay attention, Those were the days. But the coffee house scene was like, in the corner of the restaurant idea. But you were programmed and advertised, people bought ads in the paper to tell who was on. And eventually it was in Melbourne, for instance, it turned out to be, we didn't realise it at the time, but the longest running 7 nights a week folk club in the world was in Melbourne. That was Frank Trainor's, which eventually had started in one location and had to open up a few doors down at the same time, so that if you play, and then there was a third location, and you would play, and then you'd trot round the corner and play for a different audience, and upstairs here and downstairs there, very busy. Whereas in Sydney, for instance, I know that there was one guy who ran a heap of clubs, and he would do a similar thing, except you'd finish one set and you'd be taken, chauffeured, driven to the next club, and so on. So he'd be filling various clubs and just employing you for one night, it was big music and a big music scene. And I feel lucky that I stumbled upon it at the time it was so popular, because nowadays if I was devoted to that sort of music, there aren't quite the same facilities for you anymore. It's not really on this... It's on a tiny level, like sessions in pubs perhaps, and then it's basically festivals, folk festivals, and it's not much in between anymore. Judith Durham was the, what we used to call the chick singer. Chick singers she was with Frank Trainor's Jazz Preachers, and it remains her favourite type of music. I shouldn't speak for Judith, but... and then she joined the Seekers, because the Seekers originally were just the 3 guys, and Judith joined them. I remember being at what was their farewell concert, but it wasn't even advertised as such. It was just their last concert before they got on the ship. They got a job singing on a cruise ship to England, and they said, "Oh, we're off next week to England." And what had been interesting was that the same venue where I did my first gig, Emerald Hill Theatre, and all the people who were going to perform in the concert sat on the stage for the entirety. People would step forward for their own set, and there were 12 of them on the stage, and I remember looking around myself and, oh, there's 12 of us in the audience. And that was the Seekers' Goodbye to Melbourne concert. And, you know, they became so popular. And when they finally came back to Melbourne, I think they still hold the record for the largest attendance of a performance in Australia, probably. It was the Sydney Myer Music Bowl. Yes, I took over when she left the jazz band. I became the singer with Frank Trainor's Jazz Preachers, which worked quite well because I was doing the folk stuff and the jazz stuff. And in fact, people would get 3 for the price of 2 then when we did joint programs, because I would do my own solo stuff. Maybe a bass player from the band would play. The band would do their stuff and then I'd join the band. And in fact, later on, Frank Trainor organised these rather, well, very large concerts at Melbourne Town Hall annually, history of jazz type concerts, and I'd open them playing African music. And then appear later on doing jazz standards and doing gospel and whatever, you know, in amongst the ragtime pianists and the jazz bands, etc. Enjoyed hearing other people doing bush songs, etc., but not many of them were from the female point of view for a start. I enjoyed joining in the choruses, that sort of thing. I don't know why, but I was much more drawn to Black American music and the roots of that going back to African. And come to think of it, back in the 60s into the early 70s, we had very few African performers in Australia, you know, very few, and probably none, you know. And so I didn't feel at all bad about singing this neglected music. But nowadays, you think twice about doing it because we have lots of genuine African performers right here, you know. But I think I introduced the African thumb piano to most people who heard it back in those days. And on my first album, there was an African song, I know. And, it's still an interest of mine. I mean, I finally got to Africa in the 90s, but people presumed I must have been there earlier than that because here I was singing this material. Well, I mean, I would probably be, in the early days when I started, I would probably be one of 2 right-wing folk singers on the scene. So I used to say I would be the only one, but I've thought of one since who definitely was. That was just my background, you know, Irish Catholic upbringing. First time I voted for the DLP. So I tell this story against myself because I just say, well, don't ever panic, you know, adults can change. But it was through folk music that I was changed, because I thought, oh, these people are singing these protest songs and how pathetic the songs are. You know, they're really just like a slogan set to a chant. There's no poetry in there. There's not much melody and no subtlety. You know, and I was quite happy to dismiss it. But it was definitely part of the scene. It was, you know, motivation for a lot of, well, you know, things like bush ballads came from that background. But and it was insidious, really, because I discovered a songwriter from America called Melvina Reynolds, and some of her stuff is very well known. People don't realise she wrote Little Boxes and Morningtown Ride and etc. What Have They Done to the Rain? And it was that song that I learnt, which is an anti-nuclear song, but it doesn't mention that it's anti-nuclear. It's quite poetic, it's melodic and it's subtle, and I learnt this song and it's all been downhill since then. You know, so this was my creeping into being politically engaged, which of course it turns out I'm very happy to be, and being involved with the Black American music, gospel music, all of that. It was co-opted for the civil rights movement, just change a phrase or whatever, and you've got civil rights marching song from a gospel song and so on. And then I found, I was singing these sorts of songs. We weren't, ironically, we didn't sort of link it up in the early stages with the Aboriginal push for equal rights also, but that came sort of later, even via the Springboks protests, etc. Oh yes, well, what about the Aborigines? Oh, okay. Although on my first album, for instance, I took a song that was written about the situation in South Africa, and I localised that and put it on my first album. But as I said, that was like 1973, like not that early. Well, there is some famous photos of me on the back of a truck in Burke Street, I'd say. And basically, at that time of the protests against the Vietnam War, they were huge, and they certainly, changed people's attitudes towards it, and definitely helped change the politicians' actions. So, sharing the back of the truck with Dr. Jim Cairns, for instance, and the music was woven into all the protests and in between the speakers, and I was called upon quite a bit, partly because I had a big voice. So, and I was never I never made the speeches or did much of the drudgery work like sticking stamps on envelopes. I'm very happy to be called on, for rallies and benefits and etc. But of course, it's no big sacrifice. I never heard about jobs that I didn't get because I was seen as a protest singer. And also, what other job do they applaud you every 3 minutes? Everything you do, you don't think, this is amazing, this will change the tide of history or whatever. You're just there and you do it, and then you're off and somebody else is up. We realised it was getting bigger and bigger and it was important. But at the same time, you don't think, this will be it. This could really make a huge difference. I didn't do the drudgery, so I can't take too much credit for what. But I was always happy to be called upon and, if necessary, learn new songs. And there was even a song on my first album that was to do with conscientious objector against the war. And but it was not a protest album. That was there in amongst, nonsense songs and an African song. And, yeah, I can't be categorised really. That's the trouble. I never made a smart career decision. Here's my blues album. So you know what it is. You can relax. No, I just did a great variety of songs and keeps me amused. So. I was never an initiator of those things, but I suppose early on I was involved. But that's again because people call on you, and of course there were songs being written or programs put together that emphasised various aspects of the women's movement as it was in those early days. For instance, Glenn Tomasetti, the woman who gave me my first gig, she put together a fantastic program simply called She, and I think the program is in the Performing Arts Collection now. And the first half of the concert was historical, traditional songs from wherever, whenever, about women's situation, and then the second half was contemporary songs, some Australian, and I think we finished up, it was 1973, so I think we finished up with I Am Woman, Hear Me Roar, And then that particular program was taken to Sydney and Canberra as well. So, and by then I was even singing the song that became the one song that enabled me to have a minor hit and appear on Countdown. Was a song written by Bob Hudson called Girls in Our Town, and I remember that was in the She concert program. And so it was, again, stylistically quite a range, musically being covered. But I also found it just a tad ironic that all of these women's programs, music programs, were coming into being, and I'm thinking, well, this is good, but I don't actually want to be categorised just, I'm singing because it's a women's program. I'm happy to join you, but then I hope to have equally, if not more, of a career out there where it's music first, and maybe I'm the only woman on the program. So there were some singers who were coming up who started at the time, and so that was their forum. But I would be in there and also rush out. I was impressed that it was on the hit parade, because it was not your typical hit parade sort of material. It had a bit heavy, a blatant message, but it was a catchy tune, and the clip was good. There weren't so many clips even back then, but I was pleased that a song like that, which was quite obviously what it was, a women's liberation song, would be a chart topper. So and I can't remember exactly when it was that I actually saw Helen Reddy in concert, but it was later on. It was when she had Peter Allen as her opening act, and that was the first time I saw Peter Allen, but he didn't last very long on the tour because he upstaged her, so and her husband fired him nicely, but. Oh, absolutely. I mean, we probably thought it changed more than it did, because I'm not sure music as such changes people's minds. I think it reinforces the way they're already thinking or starting to think. It's part of the mix. And I still thought that being an entertainer was the most important thing. There were these righteous songs, but you had to couch them in a way that made it less preachy, and I find actually that humour is a very handy tool when you're actually trying to make a point about a social issue. It may be that you do a humorous song or parody rather than a hitting people over the knuckles type song. Although then, straight out powerful message occasionally, or subtle. It's got to be a mixture. Why did I make that album? Well, a record producer said, "Have you ever made an album?" He'd brought out Sydney Carter for a tour of Australia. Sydney Carter's not very well known even back then, but he wrote Lord of the Dance, which is a well-known song. And I was programmed as his opening act. And the guy who brought him out made albums on Move Records, and still going. And he said, "Oh, have you made an album?" "No. Would you like to?" "Oh, okay." And then he said, thinking of the budget, he said, "Do you mind if we do it live? It's cheaper." And I said, "Oh, okay. I'll see if I can hire Trainer's venue for a couple of nights." So that's exactly what I did. Recorded did a concert 2 nights running, 16 songs. So same songs twice. Picked 12 of those, and I had a keyboard player and guitarist and double bass player and percussionist and a guy who played flute and sang background, and I wanted it to be a range of material, but the Conscientious Objector song was in there, and People Get Ready even was a civil rights song in the style of a Negro spiritual, as we called them back then, called African American now. But it was a mixture. I'm always looking for variety within, even if it's it's a blues night or whatever. I would be doing more variety in my blues than I guarantee anybody else would be doing. It's partly to keep myself amused, but partly to keep other styles of songs before the public, because as a non-songwriter, I'm quite happy to, go searching elsewhere for little gems that will disappear otherwise, because let's face it, if everybody who writes songs only sings their own songs, then all those other wonderful songs won't still be presented, because I sort of come from the era when songwriters tended not to sing and vice versa. Cole Porter, I don't think, ever made an album, and Frank Sinatra never wrote a song. And all of a sudden, post-Dylan era, people presume that if I put my stamp on the songs and they may not have heard them, so they think that I've written them. So I have to make a point of saying at least once in my program, if I neglect to say who wrote that song, the one thing you can be sure of, it's not me. I'm very happy to edit and localise and choose accordingly, but they're not by me. I've recorded one or two what do we call them, standards, and in my never humble opinion, I've done the world's second best version of Imagine. I've done the world's second best version of Stormy Weather. If I wasn't so clever, I would say I've done the best version. But everybody's going, but of course you can't do a better version than John Lennon. Yeah, that's okay. Have you heard my version? But no, I don't tend to do well-known songs. There's so many fantastic songs out there, undersung, and we just have to find a way and a time to present them. When I was over in France, I was in Cannes at the MIDEM, the Music Industry Festival, in about 1974. And some little person, everybody's little to me, I'm 6'4", I got a tweak on the elbow and I turned around and there's this young guy there and he said, "You don't know me, Simon Heath, but I've just signed a contract with Lou Reisner." Actually, he hadn't signed a contract, it was a letter of intent, but Lou Reisner had presented Tommy and various rock operas, and Simon had written a rock opera, Mephistopheles, and he said, "Lou Reisner's going to present my rock opera and I'm going to go back to Australia and I'm going to have my own little record label, Ritz Records, and I'm only going to have 6 artists and I want you to be one of them." Sure, yeah, okay, pull the other leg. But anyway, I gave him my phone number and I never expected to hear from him again. But sure enough, he rang and we got into the process of, would I make an album? Yeah, sure. And he said, "But we better do a single first." And I said, because I was not commercial, we disparaged the commercial music scene a bit. And I said, "Well, I don't know about playing that top 40 game, there's only certain types of songs they want." I said, "Well, you pick a song that you think might rocket up the charts. If I don't hate it, I'll do it as long as I can pick the B-side." And he said, yeah. So Captain Jack, a song from Reg Livermore's current show, was a big hit. It was very dramatic. It's about 7 minutes long, though. It was totally unsuitable for a single, which is like 3.5 minutes max usually. And so big editing job there. Synthesizers and drum tracks, about 8 drum tracks, and totally different to my usual presentation. And the lyrics were stuck on the microphone stand. I've never used them before or since. The A-side was this rock song, and luckily I picked, for the B-side, Girls in Our Town, which was never going to be a hit because, well, for a start, it was in 3/4 time. You can come to the present day, it's never going to be sampled either. Nobody samples anything in waltz time, if you think about it. However, and Ritz Records were going to go out through a bigger company festival, and they listened and they said, "Oh, I don't know, we're not going to label. We're just not going to say which side's an A-side or a B-side." And luckily for me, the popular side was not Captain Jack, because imagine if it had gone up the charts and I'd gone out on the back of it, I would have had to either get up there and say, sorry, no band, it's not going to sound like you think it's going to sound, or else hire a band and basically dismiss them for the rest of my set, or learn a repertoire that fitted in with this style, which I'm still happily singing Girls in Our Town. Well, I never tinkered with the straight presentation of Girls in Our Town. Other songs just say, time to give it a jazzy feel or whatever. No, it just was like reportage almost. It was, yes, there were sort of sad and slightly whimsical things happening in it, but you just left it. It was just a slice of life, and it was inspired by Newcastle, but it's got a country town feel to the story, and I find that as I travel the world in the English-speaking countries, people invariably come up to me and say, look, I know that song was written about your country, but it could equally have been written about where I was born or whatever. And in spite of Newcastle being an industrial city, as it was then, and sixth largest city in Australia, it definitely had that sort of small town feel to the story. And people are also amazed that it was written by a guy. Bob Hudson wrote that. Bob Hudson was a DJ on Double J, as it was then in Sydney. And so Double J, which were breaking hits, they wouldn't play it because they could be accused of nepotism, and it wasn't going to go anywhere there. And 2SM was a religious station, and the song mentioned the pill, so they won't go to program it. They were the big hit station up there. Wasn't going to happen in Sydney. And somebody, I don't know who this guy is, I owe him a debt of gratitude, but he came to Melbourne and knew Stan Rofe, who was with 3XY, I think, one of the 2 top 40 stations in Melbourne. And this guy, John, his name was, he said to Stan, there's this song that's just come out, you might like it. And Stan said, sure, I like it, but it's totally unsuitable for my program. He said, I like it so much eventually. Play it again, play it again. I like it so much, I'm going to put it on low rotation for 3 weeks. And that's all it took. And never got to the top. Of course, it crept into the odd top 20 there and hovered there ever so briefly and crept straight out again. But that meant that it was bubbling under beforehand, and it's, a blast from the past now. It means I'm in things like the Encyclopedia of Rock, I'm happy to do that song still, and if I leave it out of a program, I invariably get complaints. Oh, I was waiting for Girls in Our Town. Oh, okay. And luckily, I'm quite happy to keep singing it, Girls in Our Town, it's about young women who they're sort of drifting, really. Girls in our town go to parties in pairs, sit around the barbecue, give themselves airs, then go to the bathroom with their girlfriend who cares. Girls in our town are so lonely, and girls in our town are too good for the pill. But if you keep asking, they probably will. Sometimes they like you, or else for the thrill, and then explain it away in the morning. It's very good. And then finally, Girls in our town, finally they have kids of their own, basically, and grow up, and they sort of a sad, wonder what'll happen, type song. But it resonates still. We're talking, 40 years later after I recorded it. It was inspired by Newcastle, but it definitely has that sort of, well, you can live in a big city and still have a small town attitude, and that's what it was. The first time the Australia Council, well, it was called the Australian Council for the Arts back there, as opposed to the Australia Council now. I got a music study grant in 1974 for 6 months overseas. Most of that time was spent in the United States, although I also went to Europe on the same trip. It was music study. I mean, I have to qualify that immediately because, for instance, I don't read music. It's not music study in that sense. It was to go and immerse myself in the milieu of the music that I was interested in and was starting to even lecture on and obviously perform. And so I did. I met so many people known to me already, but people who weren't, and discovered lots of new people in the styles of music that I was interested in, and I was able to send back music that I wouldn't have ever come across otherwise. And what else can you say about the fact that you're finally in the place where you've been singing this music and singing it and studying it for quite a while already, but now you're there, and I wasn't performing. And that was the first study grant from the Australia Council, and the second one was, let me see, 20 plus years later, they helped me go to West Africa. And that was my first and last trip to Africa. I went to 3 countries. The Gambia, I based myself because the colonial language is English and my French is not that great, but I also went to the Francophone countries surrounding the Gambia, Senegal and Guinea, and especially Guinea because in the 60s, the first African cultural troupe that left Africa and came out into the world was called Les Ballets Africains. It was from Guinea, and they had the dance and the song and the instruments, etc. And that's how I got interested in West African music, especially the kora, the double harp lute from various West African countries. And I studied the kora in the Gambia. To the extent where I realised I'll never be a great kora player, but I did perform with it for a little while. The only other time I've got a grant was the Queensland arts funding body gave me a bit towards a return trip to New Orleans because I was doing music programs in the schools for Musica Viva, and I was. So I was presenting. I was the national presenter of Black Gospel music on Australian radio, and so I went back to these gospel conventions in America. The first one I went to was back in 1974 on my first. That was my first overseas trip, the one financed by the Australia Council, and. I was one of about 5 white faces in the whole thing. When I went back subsequently in the 90s, maybe 10-20% of people were non-black. However, a large percentage of those were Japanese because the Japanese had discovered black gospel singing and were bringing over conductors to Japan and teaching them. They were mostly Buddhists, but they'd come, they'd hire charter flights and be there singing. So, everything's become more international, more accessible. Once upon a time, only black people sang black music, but now it's like all opened up. So, which is good in a way. Carrillo Gantner took me to China. Carrillo Gantner was the first of our cultural attaches to Beijing, I'd say, probably before it was Beijing. And he had a brief from the Australian government really to assess what sort of Australian music and culture would be best in a cultural exchange. And so a group of us were put together. It's called the Australian Theatre People's Tour of China. Unfortunately, the Chinese therefore thought we were an acting troupe or something, whereas most of us were not like me, performers or self-contained performers. There were administrators, etc., who were in on this tour. But and I was asked specifically because I was a self-contained act. That's why I can say things like, I have performed for the Shanghai Symphony. I don't say I performed with the Shanghai Symphony, but they performed for us. And then, okay, Margaret, what are you going to do? And so I sang Summertime, made a point of saying it's from a folk opera, So, and then I was questioned by my interpreters later on saying, so this is how this song was in the opera. And George Gershwin wrote it like that. And I said, well, actually, no. I have it in my brain as like a soundtrack, the original, which might have gone, summertime. But I'm not going to sing it like that. I'm going to sing it every day. It's different. And it might be, summertime. And Chinese music at that stage, there was no improvisation, there was there's this music for the People's Liberation Army, and there's this music in the theatre. We'll have the orchestra in the pit, like in the movies, and there's revolutionary songs and there's traditional songs. There was no equivalent of a Randy Newman making up songs or anything. And so all of this happened throughout the tour, but eventually I said to everybody in the party, it's Party Pieces time, because the Peking Conservatorium is going to do an hour concert for us, and me singing one song is not going to cut it. It's just... so, you've all got party pieces, it's time to polish them up. So we actually got, about 20 minutes worth of program, quite respectable program out of these people who normally, like Carol Burns, I had the actress Carol Burns reciting a Kath Walker, as she was then, poem, and I had a bull roarer, which I gave to Aubrey Mellor, the theatre director, and he stood there and whipped it around and, gave atmosphere. And John O'May, the musical theatre singer, he did a presentation. Richard Bradshaw had been getting away with little silhouetted hopping kangaroos and presenting it to somebody. Sorry, Richard. So he actually did a fantastic sort of send-up of Shakespearean drama where, somebody might be dying, but somehow they revived to make a brilliant speech, and, it was all explained, and it was a big hit. And I taught everybody a round, quite a simple round, but a lovely one, which sounded very effective. And the person who couldn't carry a tune in the bucket stood out the front and conducted, So we looked like a bit of a concert party eventually. But I've done a few rock festivals back then they tended to mix up, rock and pop with other sorts of music, or there might be a poet get up and do something, performance art or whatever. Classical guitarist or flamenco guitarist might be sort of in between Black Sabbath and Daddy Cool, So, it was just, I was booked, I did it. I didn't realise back then how amazing it all was, It's only when they make films of it or people keep referencing it or they put together a box set of, that you think, oh yes, I was part of that. Narara Festival, Maiponga, all of those rock festivals I was also on. Sometimes they put you on a small stage. Sometimes you'd be the act while they were actually setting up the next big act. But they did tend to program, like I'd be between Daddy Cool and Sherbet or something, and partly because I was easy to set up, and I'd sometimes have a smaller set than they did. I'd only have to do 20 minutes and they'd have to do 40 minutes. But the people tended to mix and match a little more with their programming back then than they do now. 2014, the National Folk Festival gave me, what was their second Lifetime Achievement Award, which is very nice. In fact, when they rang me to tell me that they'd started this process of Lifetime Achievement Awards, I immediately started to nominate. I thought they were ringing me to ask me who did I think should get them, and I nominated somebody. Oh, well, definitely Danny Spooner should get one. And they said, well, yes, but we were actually going to give it to you. Oh, well, okay. I will accept. Oh, partly it is that, you catch up with all your friends on the scene and what are they doing, and it's great to hear your favourites again. But also you get introduced to newer, younger or travelling acts that you wouldn't necessarily stumble across otherwise. and over 2 or 3 days you get a chance to check out a lot of people and go back and hear again your very new favourites, etc. And they tend to have the odd workshops and seminars and peripheral things that you might miss out on otherwise, and interesting foods and even clothes, and it's more than just the music, but and you can flog a few CDs, hopefully. It's fantastic that the Music Vault's been established. It's what a resource for everybody, and the fact that it therefore gives us some sort of stamp of accolade, to the whole scene, and the fact that it's covering various aspects of the scene, not just whatever's the obvious choices. It's fantastic that it's available to people who can't be here in the world's most livable city, and I just love the things that are happening along the way. The so and so's collections coming in, or so and so's presenting here, and get the background from this person or this scene. It's wonderful. It's wonderful.